What I will let you know for those of you who are familiar with Afterclass, you can just excuse me for 30 seconds, but I'll just let you know that both Chris and I are founders of Afterclass. It's an ESL teacher toolkit. So if you're teaching online or in person, if you're teaching ESL, we have started a website a couple of years ago now. It contains a lot of lessons, homework, games on it. So any of you are welcome to come in and just log in. You can register here, go to afterclass.com. You can register, simply enter your email and confirm it. We'll send you a sign-up link, and then you're on a 30-day free trial. We won't charge you at the end of that trial if you decide not to continue, but go in and have a look at the lessons and see what we've got available on the site. We started this because we felt there wasn't a lot of great digital content out there for teachers in this day and age, and the business is working well. We obviously have an IELTS series up there as well, but in total there are about 580 lessons that cover about 24 different grammar areas, and then we have reading, listening, speaking, etc. Okay, so I'll get started. Just come back to the IELTS. And obviously the system, all of the materials that I'm showing you this morning are actually available on our website to use, or most of them. Okay, so very quickly what I'm going to cover, just to summarize the information, I'll go through the structure of the IELTS writing section. It's the least complex in terms of structure, as some of you will be familiar with it already. The skills that I think are needed to complete the exam successfully, obviously from the student's point of view. The question types a candidate must be familiar with, and that's easy enough in writing, as I said, compared to listening and reading in particular, which have a large range of question types. And then what to consider if you're going to take on an IELTS candidate as well. Okay, so IELTS writing at a glance, it's quite simple. It's like the reading and the listening sections. It's 60 minutes in total. In the writing section, there is a part 1 and a part 2. Part 2 is worth twice as much as part 1, and that's for both the academic and the general module. So in part 1, the candidate, and I'm talking about in the academic section, is going to be presented with visual information, different visual types, and the task is simply to provide a description and summary of that information. So as the teacher, what you can really do is focus on language that is to do with summarizing and describing particular types of information. In part 2, this is the one, perhaps it's the one section of the exam over which students will stress more than any other, and it's unnecessary. They're presented with an opinion, a problem, or an issue, and they have to write a discursive essay. Naturally, not all of us have opinions on every particular topic that we're presented with, but you know what? In these, you just have to teach your student a formula so that they can almost fake their way through. Everyone can be forced to have an opinion about something, especially if you're going to be presenting the advantages and the disadvantages or some solutions. They're really looking, they're marking your English, not your attempts they are marking your attempts at the question, but they're not marking you for your personal ideas. So you do have to have a student who has some thoughts and opinions about things, or is able to formulate opinions, but students don't need to be that well versed on every particular topic. And in my opinion, students and or candidates who undertake IELTS exam are in a very good position. They already have a good enough reading level that if they're reading widely enough, the IELTS part 2 should not cause them too much of a problem. So a couple of things to know about IELTS writing is it takes place immediately after reading, and you don't get much of a breather, but it is a different task. Listening and reading are quite similar because there are a lot of, you have 40 questions in both the listening and the reading section. You get a very small chance to breathe while they change your exam paper, and then you go straight into writing. And writing, unlike reading and listening, where you have been working constantly through and referring back to the sheet, you're now presented with a very different task. You get a piece of visual information in part 1, and they have to sit and think and plan before they answer. So one of the things you need to do when you're coaching IELTS candidates is to make them stop, because their natural instinct after 2 hours of writing answers to the listening and reading, where you are listening and transferring information, is to go at writing too fast and start putting writing down on the sheet way too early. They need to know that they should stop and plan, and then use the majority of the time to be writing, but keep some of that time aside for the planning section. IELTS is a standardized exam. It's just like TOEFL. And so I believe it's okay to teach something that's formulaic. You want to help them get through the exam, and so the 4-paragraph structure is something that they should just know off by heart. They should certainly be comfortable with dealing with certain styles of writing, and not every style of writing. So again, one of the things that you want to be able to do as a teacher or as a coach is to be able to identify the different styles of writing, whether it's discursive, whether you look at authentic English, perhaps on the BBC or the New York Times, and you decide, is this an argumentative piece, argumentative essay? Is it discursive? Is it an opinion piece? And you need to be able, as a teacher, to analyze that quite well, so that the student starts to feel comfortable to recognize the style that they need to write in, which is discursive. Okay, this is actually a personal opinion. Unless the candidate is taking lessons months before the exam, don't use your IELTS coaching time for vocabulary. Vocabulary is something that comes in with reading and listening, and it's not something that you can just give lists and lists to. I know that there are many, many books published by excellent publishers that have, you know, the top 5,000 words for IELTS, and for TOEFL in particular, it seems the SAT. I disagree with that teaching strategy unless you have a large amount of time. You just don't know enough as a teacher to know exactly what the question is that's going to come. And so I'm going to go back on my words in a minute and show you some vocabulary that I would ensure the student knows. But in general, don't use your coaching time to teach vocabulary. There are 2 areas of grammar, though, that I would make sure the student really does know, aside from the stylistics and the 4-paragraph essay. One of those is linking words. They're also known, actually they're probably more known as transition words. These are the words that make our writing more interesting, and they also allow the reader more time, or they preface an idea that's coming. So these are really, you know, the words like, we don't use them as much in speech or in informal everyday English. Words like nonetheless, I mean, the simplest ones are and, but, for, yet. But, you know, we've got everything of despite, in spite of, although, even though. These words are very important in writing. They really are. And if the student can use them, it actually helps them to slow down a bit and gather their thoughts as they're going through the writing process. Another area I think that is very undertaught by IELTS teachers is using multi-word and phrasal verbs. And what I mean by those is phrasal verbs is the standard term. Multi-word verbs is used more and more by ESL grammarians these days to describe any verb that actually is made up of 2 parts, and it's the verb and the particle, but the particle could be an adverb or a preposition. So to look at, to listen to, these are multi-word verbs, and it is amazing to which level students who already have a high proficiency will mix up the grammar of using these, particularly when they have object pronouns in using these verbs themselves. There is an argument that phrasal verbs are more colloquial and shouldn't be used in writing. I disagree with this. There are what's called prepositional phrasal verbs that are more used in spoken English than writing, but in terms of using multi-word verbs correctly, students must know the grammar behind these verbs to have effective and correct English writing. Most of you know this already, perhaps, that students worry, or they tend to worry, or it's my perception, that they are more anxious about the writing section than any other part. I don't have the answer as to why this is so. IELTS.org releases a lot of statistics, and it does appear at first glance that writing is the lowest scoring category for almost every category of student candidate, from whether you take whatever their L1 is or their country of origin. Writing appears to be the lowest, and therefore I think that creates a little bit of the stress. Okay, getting into part one of the exam. Part one is going to be a task. And the task will be to look at different visual pieces of information, as I mentioned before. So here, as a teacher, as I said, all of this information is on off class, but what you need to be ready to do and be prepared to have is get some graphs. You're going to have different types of graphs. So here we've got a bar graph. I think it's a stack bar graph from memory, and have some simple and ready to go. Obviously, on the internet, you can copy a whole lot of stuff, but it is very hard to use it to teach with. IELTS materials are not authentic. They're made for the exam. They feel and seem very authentic, but they are very well put together. You need to do the same thing as a teacher. Don't just download anything off the web. It's very easy to find them, but you'll find they're too complex. The terms are too difficult. They're often too hard to read, and the resolution is not good enough to blow them up for the student to be able to use them in an effective way. So get some graphs together. They don't have to be as well put together, but Excel, if you have Excel skills, it really doesn't take a lot of time to put some together. So here what I would do is going to seem really obvious, but I've actually seen some IELTS teachers who don't get their students to write during the exam. You can't avoid writing in the writing essay. And although it sometimes feels as a teacher when you're teaching writing that you're sitting back as a passive observer, there's nothing wrong with watching the writing process. You need to see how long it takes for your student, for example. And we've built in a chat function, which I'm not going to use today, but the reason we've put this in is when you're teaching online or with electronic devices, it's always easy for a student to divert your attention. There's no particular way of actually being able to record written information. So we've built a chat system here. So I could ask the candidate to write a sentence outlining, outlining a main feature, and off you go. You need to make sure that your student is writing during the exam. That's really important. So just start by showing them a graph such as this, and start with the main features. They will also have tasks where they're presented with a table, which is just information in another format. We're used to reading tables every day, but it's surprising when you look at a timetable or a schedule, we're looking for very specific information. Students really need to focus on everything, the column headings and all the different cells with information in them. Again, introduce it by getting them to just look at the table and give as many sentences as they can, reporting the main features of the tables themselves. And finally, IELTS also seems to use pie charts more regularly than any other form of chart. Most people are familiar with pie charts. The IELTS tasks will always have a very clear title for the graph at the top, and that's something the students can be using and paraphrasing in their exams. Once you've got them onto the main features, where possible, you will need them to start making comparisons. And when I mentioned about language that you should teach or make sure the student knows, the language of comparison is extremely, in fact, it's vital to answering part one in the writing exam. Okay, one that I really like, and it doesn't appear that often in the IELTS exams that I've seen to date, but describing changes over time. And this also brings in a whole lot of vocabulary around periods of time. And when I first started coaching my IELTS students, I didn't realize that they're quite complex in English. I don't think that it's easy to describe periods of time, or it's simply that there are so many ways to do it that I actually did a particular lesson on periods of time. So again, here I would show a nice graph, get the student to identify the main features, write down those features in no particular order, and you can start to see how your student actually views or perceives visual information. So, as I mentioned, I told you not to teach vocabulary at the beginning, and then I said I'll backtrack on that and tell you that there is a small amount that I would teach. When it comes to comparison, you're going to be comparing data from particular date ranges, and what you need to do is show this kind of information. Now, there is a lot more that you can teach, but get the students started on the basics. There are some verbs and there are some adjectives that you'll see on the right, which I find really helpful. And then whether you use our system with a built-in whiteboard or canvas, as we call it, or your own, it's so easy to get drawing. Oh, okay, well, I've only got a couple here, for instance, but you can start to get them to draw on the screen, and then you would draw on the screen, and you can have them ready to start using that language in a more productive way. So you can draw fluctuations on the screen and things like that, and hopefully get them to start describing that language. One of the things I do with my students is actually do a line over time, and I'll mark the line and then start off, and then we'll do an increase, and then I'll do just a small dip, and then I might do a rise, and it plateaus off, and then it plummets, and then it might soar, that kind of thing. So you're getting the student almost to describe in real time what's happening to whatever the piece of data is. But a whiteboard, and listen, if you don't have a whiteboard, a large white piece of paper with felt tip pens is going to work very effectively. But one of the things about visualizing is you could be doing the reverse as well. You could be telling the student what's happening to the population or to the cost and getting them to describe that visually. It's a great way of concept checking the language. So there's some of the language words and phrases describing change. Also, as I mentioned before, when the task in part one is comparing periods of time, you will need them to be able to give those periods of time, and they can't be using the same period. Although, the data stays the same, you want them to vary the language. So you've got here on the right, different ways in English of describing periods of time, and I think again, it's not all-inclusive. There's a lot more that you could give your students depending on how much time you have with them before the exam. And on the left are the adverbs, which you will notice, most of you have probably noticed from the slide before, are just the the adjective with the adverb form put onto the end. And they're all fairly easy ones to use. Okay, so once you're looking for the main features, what I would do when you've introduced the pie chart, the graph that compares data over time, and a table, what you want to do is get the student to get into a formula, oh, sorry, not a formula, yeah, I guess so, about how to approach the task one. And what they're looking for is the main features. So focus on the main theme of the chart. When we look at things visually, I didn't realize this until reasonably recently, different cultures actually approach visual data in a very different way. So what you want to do is have this little formula in front of you so that students do look for the highest and lowest numbers. Immediately, there's a possibility to make a comparison there. You want to look for growth or decline, and that's a really great way of bringing in that language that I showed you just previously. And if there are lots of categories, I showed at the very beginning, there was a bar chart, sorry, about what kinds of books students read in an English town. And there's probably too many, remembering that this is a 150-word task, to write a lot about it. So grouping large amounts of data together or categories together where possible is a great idea. And then, of course, look for the odd one out. Look for the category or the set of data that breaks the general trend. And that is quite common in IELTS. You'll have 4 things that are increasing and 1 that's decreased. So it's a nice, it's an easy win. Another thing that you will need to do, which students find a little bit complex, is describing a process. Because for all of us, including native speakers, it's not always easy to find the exact language. However, here, of course, what's going to be important, as I mentioned before, are the transition words. Things, linking words, and of course, transition words that help you, the first, next, third, finally. These are vital in describing a process. You don't need to describe everything that's happening. And in fact, in this particular this particular visual that I've provided is more complex than anything I've seen in an IELTS exam. But the idea is to get the student to decide what are the main features and to focus on those. You can't write about everything, but you want the student to really have the ability to look at something, pull out those main features, and then connect and link those main features. Another one you want to do here is when you've got the comparison of 2 graphs. That's a reasonably common thing in IELTS as well. And again, you'll need the language to show about change over time. Again, those periods of time, the language I showed you before, the different ways of describing periods of time are quite important, as are looking at the changes. So whether it's increased or decreased, declined, all of that language comes in with these tasks. A good way to introduce this, if students aren't great at looking at being able to compare graphs, is simply doing it with the student. You can get a very large piece of paper, draw 2 stick men, put 2 dates above them, today's date, and look at the different changes that have happened and use this language for the student to talk about his or her own life and the changes that have occurred over time. This is a really good way to introduce a lot of this stuff. Now, the only difficulty with some of this language is it forces particular tenses in English. As most of you would know as ESL teachers, when you're using for and since, you'll need to either use a specific date or a period of time. And we tend to use present perfect or present perfect continuous with certain time words. So that's something that you may need to review, but I wouldn't put too much of a focus on it, depending on the amount of time that you have before the student will sit the exam. So that's task 1. It should take approximately 20 minutes. It's usually not particularly stressful for the student, but they should be able to understand, they should have a formulaic approach to taking this. And it really only requires you to have a set of tables, a pie graph, a graph that shows changes over time, and I've forgotten the other one that I showed you, a small amount of vocabulary that really is essential for describing change and contrast, and make sure you've got a couple of backup lessons. I'll just show you very briefly. We've got a whole bunch of lessons, for example, on linking words and transitions. So you can ask the student to do some of those lessons with you. And phrasal verbs, or multi-word verbs, as I prefer to call them, are very effective for the writing section, task 1 as well as task 2. So the format of the IELTS writing part 2 test is that they have to write the discursive essay, and it should be approximately 250 words long. They will be given a specific topic. So you have twice as many points to gain on this section of the exam. So theoretically, the student should give twice as much time to it. And this, unlike the reading portion, where you're able to transfer your answers and you get an extra 10 minutes for that, obviously you don't get any of that in writing. So within that 40 minutes, make sure you're getting your student to put time aside to plan and build the mind map or whatever it is that you prefer, but there has to be some planning that goes in. Students already know, but I always repeat that no dictionary is allowed, so there's no help there. And also I find that dictionaries, while you're doing a writing task, a dictionary actually doesn't help you. It's after the writing task that the dictionary should come in anyway during your IELTS coaching series sessions. That's really when a dictionary comes into its own and the student can actually find a better word in context, but not while they're trying to go through, because that is not how you replicate the exam itself. Okay, so the four paragraph discursive essay is what you need to coach the student on. And as I'll mention later, stick with teaching this formula. It just works. You'll see on a lot of different websites, they even tell you the number of words to put in. Some people at the conclusion say somewhere between 15 to 25, others say up to 40 words. I don't know enough about IELTS to make that suggestion, but I think as a teacher, you'll find something. As long as they have the 4-paragraph essay, they're off to a very good start. And one of the first things I do with them is just come in and get them to look at all the different parts there. And with the student, you would actually get them to, oops, sorry, I went a bit too fast then. You'll actually ask them to put all of these in order. So it's up to you how you want to do it, but get them to put them in order. They should be quite logical, and then they should memorize that pattern and stick with it every time you're doing it. And again, during this, I would be using, if I'm using After Class, I'll be using the chat function, because it does make them feel good when they're writing, and for some candidates, you will need to force them to write. I have had many candidates who complain about their writing, but when it comes to it, you have to sit them and force them to actually write in front of you during the lesson, because always, oh, I'll do that later, I'll do that later, let's just keep going, is the typical excuse. You've got to get them to write. Again, these are all the elements, and you can then decide if you're doing the four paragraph essay, which of these aspects, again, they're mixed up, should go in which paragraphs. Okay, and we've got a number of lessons that go through all of those, from the introduction, then to paragraph opinion A, opinion B, then opposing opinion A, opposing opinion B, providing supporting examples, etc., and then providing your own opinion as well. So it's easy enough to find IELTS exam papers and have a look at the questions. There's nothing that's too horrendous there for students. There's never any language that's particularly complex. But again, as I mentioned before, some students just feel that they don't have an opinion on things. But the reality is that most of us don't have opinions on everything, or we're simply impartial to particular ideas, or we just simply haven't thought about them before. So have a whole barrage of these at the ready, so that you can go through them with your students and just spend a lesson doing a whole bunch of them, where you go through and just get them to talk about, there'll be a statement, an IELTS part 2 statement, and just go through and get them to start feeling comfortable writing an opinion that they have on the topic. Some of them you're going to find they're really going to struggle with, but you'll find the strengths and the weaknesses of the student, and that will help you to identify perhaps the areas that you need to really help them in expressing opinions. So here I've got a very generic question about spending the whole day at the computer. IELTS examiners aren't cruel. They're going to do something that everybody should be able to respond to in some way. They don't pick they never have religious topics or political topics. It's always very kind of standard across the whole 21st century world type of issue. So that does help them get off to a good start. The problem and solution essay is very typical. So writing a discursive essay here about problems and solutions. Paraphrasing is paramount. However, if you have already taught your students speaking, if you've taught the speaking section of the exam, paraphrasing is a vital skill. It's vital for speaking, or for the production of speaking, but in IELTS reading and listening, they use paraphrasing to an enormous extent. So paraphrasing is something that your student has to be very, very familiar with. In fact, they should feel fully comfortable with it, because it's very important. Although people feel as though they're stating it again, that's exactly what they're doing. It does actually help the students to think about that they understand the topic they're about to write about, and that they are imparting that knowledge. to the examiner. So then they're going to describe the specific problem, and the other thing is suggesting solutions. This is sometimes where students come a little bit unstuck because it's a confidence issue. Again, the examiners aren't going to go out and test those solutions. They're just looking at the student's English and their ability to answer the question. So this is where the planning stage is really important, because the student wants to have in a problem and solution essay at least 2 or 3 specific problems and suggestions of solutions. It doesn't matter if they're inventing them, because that's what they're doing as they're going along. The conclusion, as I said, really, most people go up to about 50 words maximum. So that really only allows for like 2 or 3 complex English sentences. It's not an out of control thing to expect them to write. In my lesson, I've also given another way, rather than doing problem, solution, introduce the 3 problems that the student would find with this topic, and then describe the three solutions. So it's just an alternative way of dealing with the same topic. Okay, getting to the end, advantages and disadvantages are a very common theme as well, and there is particular language in advantages and disadvantages. And one of them is that the IELTS questions, to identify an advantage and disadvantage question in IELTS, they will probably paraphrase in a particular way. It's rare to get a question that says, what are the disadvantages and advantages of such and such? But you will see that they will use pros and cons, pluses and minuses, benefits and drawbacks, good and bad aspects. And this is language also that the student can grasp onto to paraphrase the question when they first start. Okay. Also, you want them to be able to make balancing statements. When they're looking at an advantage and disadvantage questions, you want them to use, again, some particular language that helps them to describe this situation. So as I mentioned, when I'm doing the task 1 situation, words like decline and increase, and here with the essays, I will actually give them a small amount of language here as well. As I said, depending on the amount of time you have with the IELTS candidate before the exam, I wouldn't be focusing too much on vocabulary, but there should be a minimum to answer the standard IELTS questions. Okay, so finally, a little bit of anecdotal evidence from me. It's not published research, so you're free to disagree with it if you've had IELTS candidates. Students, as I said, mentioned before, they tend to stress over IELTS writing, and particularly part 2, more than any other section of the entire IELTS exam. I don't know why this is, but part of your job as a coach is to calm them down over it. I actually find that IELTS writing tasks are, in a way, they're formulaic. And that leads me on to the second part. As much as, of course, as a good teacher, you are not always going to teach the test, the reality is that students who are sitting IELTS and TOEFL and SAT, if you're teaching that, are under enormous pressure. They're under the pressure of gaining admission to a higher education institution. They're under the pressure to succeed for an immigration application, and they often have parental pressure as well, the younger IELTS candidates. So be very careful about wandering off the path and teaching them great writing stylistics when really what they want is to increase their score. And be very aware, as some of you probably are, that as the teacher, if you're going to coach IELTS, you really need to know the structure of the test, because a student may come to you and it is already the 2nd or 3rd time they are coming to you, that they've sat the test, taken the test, and they're coming to you to increase their score. They often already know a lot of information about the test. They know the time frame in which it happens, how stressed they felt, the number of other students in the room. And if you are not familiar with the whole concept of how an IELTS exam proceeds, it doesn't make you look good. So make sure you're up to date with the students' L1, what the standard scores, what the mean scores are for the students from those countries. There is a lot of information available on IELTS.org They're quite open with a lot of the information. So make sure that you're up to date as a teacher and that you find out if your student has sat IELTS before, and often I think the average is 2.3 times that every candidate sits the test. You want to make sure that you know as much as the student, as much as you can, and be able to answer as many questions as possible for the student. That brings me back to teaching the test. I think you have to do it for IELTS, TOEFL, the standardized test. There's just too much at stake. And for many students, it's a very expensive test to sit. I think I'm not 100% sure, but I believe it's somewhere around the $230 US mark at the moment to sit IELTS. And I think it's standardized across all countries. I've only seen it in a few currencies, so I'm not 100% sure, but it can be a big expense for the student and or the student's parents. If they're sitting at a minimum of 2.3 or on average 2.3 times, it is an expensive test. Then they're paying you as well. Finally, the one thing I think that works really well with IELTS writing is reading. And this is another reason that I don't teach specifically a lot of vocabulary for writing the IELTS writing exam. Reading is a great way for students to look at new vocabulary and seeing it in context. And then I often follow an IELTS reading lesson with an IELTS writing lesson in which I might take the topic that we've read about, formulate a question, and then hopefully that will encourage the student to produce some of that language that we used in the reading section. And that really enables them to, it's a correct follow-on task. Although that doesn't happen in IELTS, the reading and the writing things, tasks are very separated. But it allows you as a teacher to kind of informally teach vocabulary or structures that have appeared in the reading exam. That's probably about all I wanted to start with or finish with today. As I mentioned, I'll just come back and show you that on our, just going to close this lesson. As I mentioned, with IELTS writing, we've actually got a series of lessons. I think there are approximately 14 lessons. You can see here across the middle the IELTS listening, reading, writing, and speaking, which are actually the order in which the exam progresses. But of course, if you're going to teach the IELTS, if you're going to coach candidates for the IELTS exam, I highly recommend that you break up, listening. You don't want to do 12 listening lessons followed by 15 reading lessons. So break it up, switch it up a little. In the drop-down lists here, you can see the different lessons that we have. We've already done a webinar on IELTS reading and listening, so you're welcome to find those on our YouTube channel. And I think we've also got, as I mentioned before, about 580 other lessons that cover different aspects of grammar. In particular, I mentioned the phrasal verbs, which I find, multi-word verbs that I find very helpful for IELTS candidates, not just in reading either, and some linking word or transition words that I mentioned here before. So that's probably about it from me.